Merdeka! Lagi sekali yang bersemangat merdeka!
Kuan Yew braced himself early on in life to face history's tumultuous tides full on. From the hardships of war, with a fledgling nation in tow, he leapfrogged decades and pushed past history's disruptive currents. He survived its undertow and brought Singapore to where it is today, without letting time nor tide deter him.
He's a one-man world intelligence agency.
A man of total rectitude, high intelligence, and one of the great leaders that I have met.
He's got something to offer when he opens his mouth, literally. And the way he articulates that thing is really something to be admired.
He is an outstanding character, very difficult to put into a prefabricated category. He is somebody singular.
He's one of the leaders I admire most in the world. He was one of the finest leaders of the 20th century.
他是高瞻远瞩的，因为看得很远嘛，是吧？而且证明他对中心关系的这个，他不但是有这个思想，有这个言论，他有实践嘛。
Kuan Yew was only 35 when he became Prime Minister in 1959. The fate of a tiny nation with a disparate, multiracial, multi-religious population in his hands. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaysia. 2 years later, the country separated. Lee was only 41 at the time. Before him was the daunting task of safeguarding the sovereignty of a country which few thought could survive without a hinterland. Lee had to energize a stagnant economy, deal with the communist threat and communal tensions, and develop a defense force to ensure Singapore's independence. There was no precedent to follow, no manual on small state survival. Lee relied on a small, driven team in his cabinet to help him build a nation, grow the economy, fashion a coherent foreign policy, and ensure Singapore's survival. Amongst them, two were key: S. Rajaratnam for foreign policy and Goh Keng Swee, who was Singapore's first finance and defense minister. Lee and his colleagues were keenly aware of Singapore's vulnerabilities, size being foremost. Having seen firsthand how might is right in international affairs, Lee knew Singapore had to seek the maximum number of friends while maintaining its freedom to be sovereign and independent. Big powers and small alike were important. Immediately after Singapore joined the United Nations, Lee dispatched Rajaratnam and his Deputy Prime Minister, Toh Chin Chai, to Africa, Asia and Europe for 2 months to secure international recognition for independent Singapore. It was also meant to develop a caucus that would speak out against those who threatened Singapore's security.
In 1965, when we became independent, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew went around the world to tell people Singapore is now independent. We are a new country. but his major interest is to win international support and to recognize our sovereignty, and also to bring in the foreign investors, because he had to find jobs for Singaporeans.
Live and let's be friends and let's cooperate.
Wherever Lee traveled, he spoke with conviction. He had honed a talent for persuasion, his views penetrating and forthright.
I always remember once sitting in a restaurant not far from here when he had been in England and had appeared a good deal on our television. And I remember hearing two of our neighbours say on a nearby table, "Gosh, that chap, he ought to be Prime Minister of Britain."
In the early days of his leadership, it was important for Lee to have the British on his side. They had the military wherewithal that could guarantee Singapore's sovereignty, especially in the turbulent post-Confrontasi years. As Britain started withdrawing east of the Suez in 1967, Lee and Goh recognized the urgent need for Singapore to develop its own defense force. It also had to deal with the economic impact of the withdrawal. Lee was not afraid to be explicit about what Singapore needed from powers like the British. He traveled to Britain to canvass British leaders and parliamentarians.
We don't have that continuing security, then, as I wrote to Mr. Dennis Healy recently, all the significant aid in the world will be of little value. What we want is security and confidence.
No doubt the trust that the British leaders had in Lee helped to secure Singapore's stability through recognition of Singapore's independence after separation, and also in negotiations over its future. Lee successfully secured a postponement of British troop withdrawal till the end of 1971, and a soft loan of £50 million to help cushion the blow to the economy. He also brought Singapore into the five-power defence arrangements, which provided a framework for Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia and Singapore to consult each other should there be a threat of an external attack against Malaysia and Singapore. It was a way to keep Britain engaged in the region. His good ties with British leaders also helped Singapore secure air rights to London. This allowed Singapore Airlines, with no domestic routes, to go international and become a global player. As Singapore developed and progressed, Lee continued to win over British leaders, not only because of Singapore's success, but due to his precise analysis of world events. The late British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was unabashed in her admiration of Lee. She wrote of her good friend, "In office, I read and analyzed every speech of Harry's. He had a way of penetrating the fog of propaganda and expressing with unique clarity the issues of our times and the way to tackle them. He was never wrong."
Whenever she was traveling anywhere in Asia, she would always try to find a reason to divert her plane to Singapore, sometimes even only for a few hours, because she really enjoyed talking to Lee Kuan Yew, felt she learned a great deal from him.
Beyond ensuring survival after the withdrawal of the British, Singapore needed to secure its relationship with its immediate neighbors. Though Lee was adept at brokering good ties for Singapore, it wasn't always easy. The relationship with Malaysia, for example, was a complicated one. The bitterness from past events like racial politics, merger and separation continued to weigh on relations. Even though bilateral issues would ruffle feathers over the years, Lee managed to maintain a good relationship with Malaysia's first Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman. In his memoirs, Lee wrote that he got on with Tunku, who saw him as young, a little too smart for his liking, and always too full of ideas, but otherwise all right. It was also a great advantage that Lee and his wife could speak fluent Malay. He wrote, "I was completely at home talking to his wife. Chu also spoke good Malay. This proved to him that we were Malayans at heart and not Chinese chauvinists." Despite the good relations between the two leaders, water, a very fundamental resource, remained a sensitive issue between the two countries. Lee wanted to ensure that the two water agreements signed with the Johor government were honored. So the separation agreement, which recognized Singapore as a sovereign state, included a guarantee by Malaysia that it would abide by the terms of the two water agreements. The guarantee was also enacted into the Malaysian Constitution by an Act of Parliament. As a firm believer in the rule of law as the peaceful arbiter of disputes, Lee made sure that the Singapore government registered the separation agreement with the United Nations. Lee once said, "If a dispute cannot be resolved by negotiations, it is better to refer it to a third-party dispute settlement mechanism than to allow it to fester and sour bilateral relations." Water would continue to get in the way of bilateral relations. Despite the legal agreements, Malaysian politicians would occasionally make veiled threats about the provision of water to Singapore. Lee was adamant that Singapore should strive to be self-sufficient. A visionary, he dared to dream that a solution could be found, inspiring his civil servants to think outside the box for clean water alternatives.
A few days after independence, the Prime Minister of Malaysia told the British High Commissioner, "If Singapore doesn't do what I want, I'll switch off the water supply." Of course, it was meant to be passed on to me, and it duly was. So I knew that unless I could become less dependent, at that time I did not believe I could be totally independent, but less dependent on Malaysian supplies, I would always be a satellite. So the quest began for water independence. And we set out systematically from day one, 1965, let's get every drop of water in Singapore made potable.
Decades later, New Water, the name given to treated wastewater, was born. Singapore's leaders showed the way to ensure Singaporeans had confidence in the treated water. Together with desalination, increasing supply from cleaning up the Singapore River and improving catchment in reservoirs, Singapore could reduce its dependence on Malaysia. Once a water-scarce nation, it has become today a leader in water technologies. A vision made possible only with the gumption and foresight of someone like Lee. The KTM railway was another thorny issue in the relationship. The station in Singapore and the land on which the tracks ran were held by the Malaysian-owned KTM and hence by Malaysia. Lee conveyed how he had felt responsible for negotiating the exchange of this land with Malaysia before handing over the reins to the new Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong in 1990. Lee negotiated a deal with Daim Zainuddin, who was Malaysia's finance minister. The agreement was signed a day before Lee stepped down as Prime Minister.
Kuan Yew wanted 50-50, but the mother wanted 70-30. So, and I told Kuan Yew, look, let's compromise, 60-40, I said, you want to do a deal, that's it, And, I think I will be able to convince the mother on that, And so as long as, you think that the mother will accept, I go along with you, I said, okay. I said, I'll do my best.
It took 20 years and another generation of leaders for the deal to be implemented.
He has been saying in many ways that he would like to see a better relationship between Singapore and Malaysia. That I know. I know, and from what his discussions were, from the questions he asked, he does care.
Lee continued to focus on achieving what he termed a win-win relationship with the Republic's closest neighbor, while staying focused on building a stable environment in the region. Indonesia looms large in Southeast Asia as its most populous, diverse, and geographically its biggest nation. Lee understood that stability in the region was very much dependent on Indonesia. President Sukarno launched Konfrontasi in 1963, an armed campaign against the formation of Malaysia that lasted till 1966. In 1965, a bomb set off in Singapore's McDonald House by 2 Indonesian saboteurs killed 3 and injured 33. Singapore caught, tried and executed the 2 Indonesian Marines, despite appeals from their government. This severely tested relations, sparking protests in Indonesia. But the executions reinforced what Lee firmly believed, that the rule of law must be maintained, and that Singapore, as a small state, would not bow to pressure by bigger powers. Still, Lee believed in building strong ties with Indonesia. In his first state visit in 10 years in 1973, he scattered flowers over the graves of the 2 Marines.
Well, I think it had a tremendous psychological impact, and it was, I think, a very wise move on the Singaporean side to include this laying of the flowers in the program of the visit at that time. And this, I think, was very well accepted.
I believe that our discussions this afternoon has brought us closer and enabled us to have a better understanding of our respective thinking on the common problems that face us in Southeast Asia.
Lee focused on building strong ties with President Suharto, and over the years, the 2 leaders developed a close and special relationship. This allowed them to lead ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, into a strong regional grouping, ensuring the stability of the region. After Suharto's fall from power in 1998, Lee wrote, "Suharto had concentrated his energies on stability and the economy. His policies created the conditions for strong economic growth from the 1970s to the 1990s in all ASEAN countries. They were golden years for Southeast Asia." ASEAN was established in 1967. It was the initiative of the foreign ministers of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore and Thailand. The grouping, an emblem of unity in the region, helped normalize ties and build confidence between Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia and the Philippines, post-separation and post-confrontasi. Beyond that, it was a chance to gain strength through solidarity. Lee anticipated a power vacuum that would come with the British withdrawal and the possibility of the US leaving the region. ASEAN would fill this gap. It had been Lee's belief that the United States' participation in the Vietnam War helped buy time and stability for Southeast Asia. For Lee, even though the Americans failed in Vietnam, their intervention gave Southeast Asian countries the opportunity to develop their economies, even as they struggled with a real and present communist threat. ASEAN had been formed against the backdrop of both the Cold War and the Vietnam War. It was soon called upon to show what it could do to engender regional solidarity. In 1975, the Vietnamese Communist movement had beaten the Americans. There were mounting concerns that it would next turn its attention to converting Southeast Asia to communism. The Vietnamese occupied Cambodia in 1978. Thailand, a frontline state, was a likely next target. Lee saw Vietnam's actions as defiance of international law and against the fundamental principle of sovereignty. He was adamant that aggression should not pay. If Vietnam got away with invading Cambodia, the rest of Southeast Asia could fall victim to any country bent on occupying it. Lee embarked on a two-pronged strategy to stop Vietnam. The first was the diplomatic route, lobbying support in ASEAN and the UN against Vietnam. The other, to rally ASEAN to provide arms, training and funds to support the non-communist resistance movement in Cambodia through a covert operation. Lee worked with Rajaratnam, his foreign minister, to gain consensus among ASEAN members. Rajaratnam, whom he called a born crusader, convened a special meeting of ASEAN ministers in Bangkok, which issued a joint statement deploring the invasion and calling for the withdrawal of all foreign forces in Cambodia. Eddie Thieu, who led the covert operations to support the non-communist resistance movement, remembers the key role Singapore played in keeping all partners on board.
Ronald Reagan and his advisors were very uncomfortable about setting up a non-communist resistance to fight alongside the Khmer Rouge, which was backed by China. And it took all his charm and wit to persuade the Americans to come on board.
Eventually, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand and the US banded together to support the resistance forces.
Where Singapore was concerned, we gave arms, and we also helped the non-communist resistance to set up a broadcasting capability along the Thai border with the help of a British consultant.
Air Marshal Sit Savatsila, Thai foreign minister at the time, recalls Lee's key role in preventing Vietnam's dominion from being a fait accompli.
I remember that Prime Minister Kreng Sak have related to me that Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was the first person to write him a letter telling him that ASEAN should stand steadfast together. That time, even Americans have Vietnamese syndrome. They just left, the Vietnam, and they try not to come back again. So everyone afraid of him. Everyone afraid even to mention Vietnamese invade Cambodia. They would say that was invasion of foreign forces.
From that point, ASEAN took a united stand, supported the Cambodian coalition led by Prince Norodom Sihanouk, and pressured the Vietnamese to withdraw. This finally happened in 1989. Lee later wrote, "We had spent much time and resources to thwart the Vietnamese in Cambodia because it was in our interest that aggression be seen not to pay." As Singapore worked hard to establish regional security through ASEAN, it also maintained a special relationship with Brunei, a similarly small country in Southeast Asia. As small states, they share many common concerns, particularly on sovereignty and independence. The late Sultan Omar Ali had a close friendship with Lee, which enabled strong ties between the two countries. Lee said in a speech in Brunei in 2009, "He trusted me because I never took advantage of his friendship to ask for favors. On one occasion, he asked his sons to sit in when I met him, and he told them that I was a friend who could be relied upon. He wanted the friendship between us to continue with his sons. It has." Today, the armed forces of the two countries train together regularly. In 2007, both countries celebrated the 40th anniversary of their currency interchangeability agreement, which allows their currencies to be accepted in each other's countries. Lee had advised and helped Brunei to join ASEAN. In 1984, Brunei became its 6th member. Today, the 10-member ASEAN organization plays a key role in the region's security because of its many multilateral engagements and dialogue partners, including the US, China, Russia, Japan, and India. Beyond the immediate neighborhood of Southeast Asia, Lee keenly followed developments in the rest of Asia, especially the Japanese economic miracle of the 1980s. Despite his own personal experience of the suffering inflicted by the Japanese during the war, Lee still felt that there was much to learn from them. He saw that industry, discipline, and cohesion helped pull Japan out of the poverty of the post-war era and turn the country into an economic giant. Realizing the important role Japan could play in the development of Asia, Lee took pains to foster ties with its leaders and sought their investments to help Singapore grow. Former Japanese Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone credits Lee for getting Japan to be more engaged in Southeast Asia.
それは日本は戦争について非常に反省もするし、割合にそういう点から消極的でしたね。しかし、李官友首相からそういう激励を受けて、非常に勇気を持って ASEAN の諸国とも提携し協力するという方向に転換したと思います。
Lee remained interested in Japan and visited the country regularly. Lee saw that beyond Japan, China would be the next Asian powerhouse. He visited China for the first time in May 1976 and was one of the last few leaders to meet Mao Zedong before the Chinese leader died. At the time, despite political chaos after the decade-long Cultural Revolution, Li could see the critical role that China would play in the future. But he saw the possible complications of Singapore's relationship with China early on. China had promoted the Communist Revolution regionally and backed the Malayan Communist Party, which refused to recognize Singapore's independence. It had also reached out to overseas Chinese to spread its propaganda in Southeast Asia through radio broadcasts. Li was concerned that Singapore, with a 75% ethnic Chinese population, should not be viewed as an extension of China or a Chinese vassal state. This changed after Deng Xiaoping, then the Vice Premier of China, visited Singapore in 1978. Deng had expected to tour an economically backward city and was shocked at Singapore's development. Li was keen to cultivate good relations. But there was a sensitive issue he needed to discuss with the Chinese leader during his visit. Li recalls in his memoirs how he hesitated to tell the seasoned, weather-beaten revolutionary what he should do. But he did, for the good of the region. Li told Deng that Southeast Asian governments regarded China's radio appeals to the region's ethnic Chinese as dangerous subversion. He asked that the broadcast be stopped. At the time, Deng simply said that he needed time to think about what Li had said. The broadcast stopped. One of the outcomes of Deng's historic visit to Singapore is that every year China sends several hundred government officials to study the Singapore experience. This has enabled ties to be established early on between different generations of leaders on both sides.
The Chinese leaders knew that Mr. Li was basically a Confucianist and had Western concepts of running a country, Western concepts of management and leadership. So they found that very useful for China.
50–60%.
So Mr. Li started the Suzhou Industrial Project, and basically it was meant to be a vehicle to foster relations between new Chinese leaders and the new Singapore leaders.
In 1994, the two countries agreed to jointly develop the Suzhou Industrial Park, a township modeled after Singapore's growth experience. Li was instrumental in the project's eventual success.
Ladies and gentlemen, may we now propose a toast to the success of Suzhou Township.
双方领导对这个公园重视空前的，而且一代一代的一届一届都非常认真。
你好，非常好。
我们这个合作可称当今世界两个规模不一样的国家，而且价值观、背景、文化，当然我们还有华文文化有共同的地方，当然我们也有不同的地方。
Li visited the project annually in the initial years to personally observe its development and help smoothen the bumps which plagued the project early on. It is now a symbol of successful cooperation between both sides and has laid the foundation for other projects like the Tianjin Eco-City. Beyond bilateral ties, the Chinese leaders were also interested in Li's deep understanding of China's ties with Taiwan. They knew that Li was close to Chiang Ching-kuo, the late president of Taiwan.
Deng Xiaoping was also then very actively involved.
And insofar as the Chinese in Beijing thought that Mr. Li and Chiang Ching-kuo really understood each other very well, then their admiration of Mr. Li gave them a chance to see what they can learn from Mr. Li about Taiwan and what Mr. Li can bring to Taiwan about what they wanted and so on.
无论为了两岸海峡两岸的关系以及整个的这个地区的一个和平安定，尤其是到了改革开放以后，唯有两岸和平发展共赢，慢慢的我们走向一个最后一个共同的一个结论，这是他的一个正确的看法，他也抱有使命感，但是他不是调人，他不做两岸之间的调停，但是他因为两岸私人的关系都很好，大家他可以把听到的台湾的看法，他可以以他的身份转告给大陆的领导人，但是他也同大陆的领导人也是可以把他们的看法这个转告给台湾人。
长年以来李先生对于两岸的关系的看法，基本上他认为双方面应该和平来相处，共同创造双赢的一个政策。那么这个政策不但对双方面是有正面意义的，同时对于东亚、东南亚乃至于整个亚洲区域都能够提供这个稳定的一个环境，或者是有助于稳定的环境。
In April 1993, China and Taiwan held their first ever talks in Singapore. This marked the first contact between senior figures from both sides since 1949. It was a major breakthrough in cross-strait relations that paved the way for future institutionalized cross-strait consultations. Li said in his memoirs that they had chosen Singapore as the venue because he had acted as a channel of messages for both sides. Always alert to creating opportunities for Singapore, Li started to visit India. In the early days, Li had hoped that democratic India would prevail as a model for the developing world. As the only world leader who had interacted with 4 generations of leaders from the Nehru family, he was however disappointed by its development, which he noted was stifled by bureaucracy and corruption. His views changed later on. Reforms introduced by a new generation of leaders to free up the Indian economy led Li to believe that India had a promising future. Li worked hard to understand the global economy, its shifts and developments, and forged ties with countries to ensure Singapore's future. Against the tide of the time, he and his team championed foreign investments when many countries in the immediate post-independence era were set on nationalization and protectionism. Li saw attracting investments as a way to kickstart the economy, provide jobs, and leapfrog the region.
Singapore has successfully built up a second wing now, in addition to its domestic economy. This has stood us in good state and make us more relevant. And now there are more jobs for Singaporeans. And I think has strengthened our economy a great deal. And Mr. Li was at the forefront, making visits overseas, opening new markets.
He knew the importance of creating good jobs.
And international investors are usually good job, higher productivity because they're exporting and they have good quality. What he played important role was convince the investor that whatever we promise them, we will honor it, that we are keen on their investments.
America, they're operating in Europe.
Lee engaged the big powers, thereby enlarging Singapore's international space. He did so to secure Singapore's future by allowing it to overcome its size and secure a global hinterland. And in the 80s and 90s, when the developed economies started becoming more protectionistic, Lee often advocated free trade on the international stage.
Protectionism and retaliation will shrink trade and so reduce jobs. Is America willing to write off the peaceful and constructive developments of the last 40 years that she has made possible?
He has always been very clear that we need external space for Singapore to be successful. And he was always very concerned about protectionist sentiments, especially during times of economic crisis. And during the Asian financial crisis, there was a certain pushback against globalization. And he spent a lot of time understanding the situation and then going out to convince investors and to convince policymakers of the right course of action.
Growth came as a result of Lee's unwavering commitment to free trade and to creating an efficient, business and tax-friendly environment in Singapore. Lee recognized very early on that the US was the only country powerful enough to stem the tide of communism and provide the stability for the region to grow. He saw the US as a major source of investments in technology. Lee thus started encouraging the US to stay engaged in Southeast Asia long before it was fashionable to do so. He took it upon himself to take a sabbatical to Harvard in 1968 to better understand America.
In a very unusual move, and as a result, I think he forged a new security relationship, a new bilateral relationship with the United States, which was not there before we became independent.
The relationship grew stronger over the years, with Lee engaging every US president since Lyndon B. Johnson.
My relationship started as one of, he was way up here and I was down here, and I learned a lot from him. But I think respect is if you had to single out one word for how it began with me, it was that. And then, as I say, as I got to know him more, it grew into what I think is a real friendship.
George Shultz, former US Secretary of State, said this of Lee: candid, informed, forceful, brilliant. These attributes explain why leaders throughout the world have sought out Lee Kuan Yew. Indeed, Shultz played a vital role in getting approval for Lee to address a joint session of the US Congress in 1985. He remembered the reluctance of the Speaker of the House to invite Lee to speak.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister of Singapore.
Admit the Prime Minister.
I said to him, well, Tip, why are you hesitating? He said, because I know pretty well what he's going to say. I said, but he's going to say good things. Well, he says, some of the members have different views, and I'm afraid that he might be too persuasive. As it turned out, he gave one of the best speeches that I've heard to a joint session, and he did put a different and powerful perspective on the importance of open trade. And he tied it into political developments as well as economic developments.
Lee's speech against a backdrop of high U.S. unemployment and an imminent slowdown in the world economy convinced and resonated with his audience. It confirmed what many leaders already knew, that he had a keen grasp of issues and how they impacted on an increasingly complex world.
There's no second Lee Kuan Yew in the world. Normally one would say that the leader of a country of the size and population of Singapore would not have a global influence. But his views were always in a much larger context than the technical problems of the Singaporean economy. And so he always had a tremendous influence on us.
Lee visited the former Soviet Union in 1991, just before its collapse. President Mikhail Gorbachev was at the time preoccupied with internal affairs and it kept Lee waiting hours before meeting with him.
I went to see him and he was there, very calm, sitting up in his bed with his glasses there over his eyes, and he looked at me in a very calm and sedate kind of way. Joe, he said, don't worry, he said, you must feel very lucky that we are seated here watching the destruction of empire. And that was his conclusion,
But Lee's opinion was that a country that continued to produce world-class scientists and athletes, even when it was in difficulty, would not stay weak forever. He was confident that in the post-Cold War, post-Soviet era, Russia would be a power to be reckoned with. A visit in 2005 proved his case. He wanted to see what opportunities there were for Singapore as he met young and driven Russian businessmen. Lee's visit strengthened his belief that it was to Singapore's advantage to engage Russia early, another relationship that would be beneficial to Singapore's future. Lee was lauded for his oratory, but for many, it was his thoroughness in getting to the root of things and his drive to gain a realistic assessment of issues impacting the world, which drew audiences.
He was pragmatic, he was a strategist, he was an artist, he understood power. But when I say he's an artist, what I mean is, when he makes his moves, it's always with a certain economy of effort. And each move would usually have multiple effects. Sometimes I compare it to someone playing with the same pieces on multiple chessboards. So when he makes a move, it has a different effect on different chessboards.
Furthermore, they will be extremely uncomfortable.
While world leaders respected his insights, there were still critics, amongst them the American media and liberal establishment, who upheld their version of democracy as the model for all countries to follow. Lee never flinched from a debate and was clear that a unilateral Western liberal democracy could not be applied universally.
He was the personification of Singapore in the world, warts and all, Some people loved him, some people hated him, but when somebody wants to put a face in Singapore, it was Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee never apologized for being firm or for the controversies he may have been embroiled in, as long as he believed they were for the good of Singapore.
To grow, China needs American markets, American investments.
Lee was not afraid to take a stand, even when it proved unpopular. By doing so, he made it impossible for a world sometimes tentative about its own moral position to ignore him. Through his counsel, charisma, and character, Lee gained himself the reputation of being a man bent on conquering tomorrow today. In so doing, he slowly but surely placed Singapore squarely on the world stage as a nation to watch. Lee Kuan Yew engaged minds and formed friendships across the globe, leaving the world indelibly marked by his very special brand of leadership. And a nation inspired to continue his legacy.
Our forefathers came here because they were looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Some found that pot of gold, many didn't. They sweated their guts out and built this city out of mud flats. We've inherited it. We've added to it. And I say it is worth defending it.